Okay, good morning, everybody. I will now reconvene the meeting of the Instructional Quality Commission, and I will pass it on over to Commissioner Chow for the Science Subject Matter Committee.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I now call the Science SMC to order. If you're a member of the Science SMC, please put your nameplate up. If you are not a member, please turn your nameplate down. So the members of the Science SMC are myself, Commissioners Chapman, Fairchild, Flores, Renteria, Wu, and of course IQC Chair Reese. Now I'd like to turn it over to Seaford staff, Dr. Brian Boyd, and Dr. Cliff Rudnick.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. As stated by SMC Co-Chair Chow, today you will review panel assignments for the 2018 Science Instruction Materials Adoption and assign panel facilitators. Please refer to the document that we sent to you previously that includes the recommended panel assignments with facilitators. So Section 9519 of the California Code of Regulations, Title 5, stipulates that each panel should consist between 5 and 15 instructional materials reviewers. Those are called IMRs. And at least one content review expert, and that's a CRE. You recommended and the state board appointed 120 reviewers and content experts. However, a number have subsequently withdrawn, and there's an incredible response with publishers. We've had a number of programs submitted, so each panel will have 6 to 7 members. One of those withdrawals was also a content review expert, so I'd also like to note that the content, some panels will not have a content review expert. But with those recommendations, we looked at their panelists' background. There's some that are early implementers, so ones that have really deep understanding of the NGSS and implementation of the standards. They will be on those panels to help support it, even if there's not a content review expert. Each panel must have a majority of IMRs who are current classroom teachers, and that requirement is also met within the panels, the recommended panels. So they are, the majority are teachers, which is a really good thing. And then the next thing I'd like to highlight also is the deadline for the publisher submissions for the adoption was February 12th, 2018. We've had a total of 20 publishers who submitted 35 programs, and that was a lot. It's probably a lot more than we were used to. Some have 10 to 12, but we had 35 programs. And so that, reduced the size of the panels. So based on these submissions and regulatory requirements, teaching experience, and stated preferences of the program review, we assigned reviewers and experts to 16 panels. And so with the hotel accommodations, we had to be really creative because we had a limited amount of space. We talked about dividing rooms with dividers, and we actually went out to the site at the Hilton, a DoubleTree, and they've come up with some really, really good ideas on how to make this possible. And so can you imagine that having, the reason why we went to 16 panels, I want to give a quick background on that, is if you had 10 panels, they would be reviewing 3 to 4 programs, and that's not feasible. So by dividing the rooms and making 16 panels, it's going to be a really good process, and we'll have a quality review too. The facilitators, okay, so also I would like to note that there will be, because of 16 panels, there'll be a facilitator, and 1 to 2 staff, CD staff members will be assigned to each panel. With the panel facilitators were assigned based on their experience too, with our adoption process and level of knowledge for the content area. Thank you, Commissioner Chow.
All right, so we have one item on our agenda today: the approval of the instructional materials reviewers and content review experts, assignments to review panels, and the selection of commissioner facilitators. I will ask Dr. Brian Boyd, the CDE lead for this adoption, to walk us through the panel assignment document.
Actually, I'll Cliff
or Dr. Rudnick.
Well,
yes.
Brian looked at me because he actually didn't have it in front of him. So the panel assignments for the 16 panels were sent to you. There have been a couple of amendments to that. One is that unfortunately former Commissioner Brian Mueller will not be able to join us. We are doing presenting a board item actually to the board. We're drafting it today. David Almquist is upstairs working on that. and that position is to be determined. We have to have that discussion and find the appropriate, it will likely be an emeritus member of this esteemed commission. Also, we've had one publisher withdraw from the adoption. That would be Stanford. They had a single grade 8 integrated program. They were assigned to panel 10 or 16, I believe. I think they were the last panel assigned, and they withdrew already for a number of reasons.
So just for reference, the revised version is in your red action folder on the right-hand
Thank
side.
you very much. I wasn't aware. Thank you, because I know the one we mailed was prior to that. So maybe in the revised one, you'll note a couple of changes to program names. The 3 STEM Scopes programs have been changed to STEM Scopes CANGSS 3D, and the textbook program or tech book program added tech book for California NGSS. They're just program name changes that were requested by the publisher after their submission, which is fine to do. It's not breaking any rules or regulations to do that prior to the review. So you can see in front of you that there are 16 panels, a facilitator assigned to each, noting who that facilitator is, and 1 or 2 CDE staff support next to each. You'll talk about this later, but if any changes are necessary based on reviewers who unfortunately can't attend at the last minute, or the wonderful opportunity for other CDE staff to help support, you will be asking the full commission for the authority that the chair and the co-chairs of the SMC can make those determinations on site during the training.
Thank you so much. So are there any commissioner comments on panel assignments for the IMRs and CREs, or do you have any questions for the CFIR staff? Okay, so no. Okay. Our second and last task of the day is to assign panel facilitators. Please note that the IQC Chair Reese, Commissioner Balmosik, and I will be providing overall support and will not be facilitating individual panels. Please review the panel assignments and corresponding programs. For the first program, the facilitator is to be determined, but likely will be a Commissioner Emeritus. Second panel is Commissioner Munoz. Third is Letty Krause, consultant with CDE. Fourth is Commissioner Chapman. Fifth is Commissioner Renteria. Sixth is Jen Buzelich, who we met yesterday, or who presented with us yesterday. And the seventh is Costa Silva, yes. An administrator with CDE. Eighth is Commissioner Flores. Ninth, Commissioner Fairchild. 10th, Alejandro Hernandez. And then 11th, Joe Thompson. 12th, Ken McDonald. 13th, Commissioner Murphy Corwin. 14th, Commissioner Emeritus Foster. Yay. 15th, Commissioner Wu. 16th, Commissioner Diaz. Are there any commissioner comments on the recommended panel facilitator assignments? No? Okay. So if there are no questions, we're ready for public comment at this time. And I see none. Right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for your interest in the work of the Science Subject Matter Committee, to everybody who's here. And then at this time, I need a motion for the Science Subject Matter Committee member. Wait, no? Yes? Okay, at this time, I need a motion from a Science Subject Matter Committee member to, 1, recommend to the full commission approval of panel assignments and facilitators as recommended by the CDE staff, and 2, empower the Science SMC co-chairs to make necessary changes to the panel assignments if issues arise due to attrition or if any other unexpected complications develop. So can I have a motion from someone from our SMC?
So move.
Thank you. The motion has been made by Commissioner Fairchild.
Seconded.
And seconded by Commissioner Wu. Is there any discussion of the motion? Okay, any final comments from the commissioners? Great. Is there any public comment on the motion? And I see none. All in favor? Okay, wonderful. Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, and the motion passes. Okay. Yeah, okay, so at this time, we're gonna go to public comment, if there is any. So if there are any speakers, I'm gonna ask them to please ask you to please identify yourself and any organizations that you're representing. But if there are none, then I'm going to close the meeting of the Science SMC. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We are now going to reconvene the full commission, so please put all nameplates up. Awesome. And we are going to kind of juggle our agenda just a bit. We're going to actually move to a presentation. And so I would like to introduce Will Parrish, founder and president of 10 Strands, Brian Ehlers, director of the Office of Education and the Environment at Cal Recycle, and Dr. Gerald Lieberman, director of State Education and Environment Roundtable. And we'll give them a minute to get prepared.
And then
You'll find the presentation in your red action folder on the right-hand side.
all right. Am I on now? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, commissioners. I'm Will Parrish, emeritus member of the IQC. I served a term from 2009 to 2012. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you this morning. We're here today to update the IQC on the status of environmental literacy in the California school system. So I will provide an overview. Brian Ehlers will give a summary of the policy around California's environmental principles and concepts. He is the director of Cal Recycle's Office of Education and the Environment under Cal EPA. Dr. Jerry Lieberman will talk about the inclusion of the EP&Cs into the frameworks. So I came into this work by being a school teacher in the Unified School System of San Francisco, and I was teaching environmental science and civics for 10 years. And to get my kids more interested in civics, I suddenly had a thought, well, why don't I bring a little environmental science over? And so my first foray in 2004 was to bring this Twinkie into class. And literally, this was bought in 2004. And it's still, as you can see, not food. So that was the topic in civics, that so many areas where the kids come from are filled with food deserts. Every corner store has junk food filled with booze and cigarettes, but where can you get a fresh bunch of carrots or a head of lettuce? And so they got incensed by this inequity of access to fresh, good food, and that was the hook that I got them interested in to the democratic process, and they took off. So better access to food, healthier communities, connecting civic involvement with an issue they see every day in their communities is what clicked. It worked so well that I began on a journey to prove out the benefits that environmental literacy brings to education across the board. I wanted to enable all teachers to use environmental literacy in teaching civics and science and every other subject, but I stuck with those two. The timing is right for teachers to use environmental literacy. It provides greater relevance to students, and it can accomplish the mission of environmental literacy for all students in California. So why is environmental literacy so important? Well, to me, there are a few reasons. Number one, our species depends on it. Humans' inextricable interdependence on natural systems is undeniable. Human societies depend on well-functioning natural ecosystems. Two, relevancy of subjects. Environmental literacy provides a continuity to the subject and something that the kids can actually see and feel around them. So we're talking about the air and the water and the food that they're involved with every day. Third now, environmental literacy provides students with the critical thinking skills and the problem-solving skills that they'll need going on into higher education or onto jobs. The fourth is, well, getting outside is just plain healthy, right? There are more and more research studies that show the importance of the brain function as it involves with nature and awe, and then coming back into the classroom, even after having been outside for a few minutes, heightens the kids' awareness of the classroom and studying and learning better. And the fifth reason is that there's cross-dimensionality. Think of it: classroom, curriculum, culture, and community. Environmental literacy is the connective tissue that provides coherence between subjects and holds them all together. So our superintendent of public instruction, Tom Torlakson, believed this as a seminal idea. And I found out about a lot of things going on in the state when I joined the IQC in 2009. Got very excited about the potential, as I described, and I stopped teaching and I set up 10 strands in 2012. In 2015, Superintendent Torlakson established the Environmental Literacy Task Force and published the blueprint for environmental literacy in 2016. Anybody who's not a new commissioner already has a copy of this, and I'm happy to provide others with a copy as well. So in 2016, Superintendent Torlakson established a steering committee to implement the blueprint. We, at 10 Strands, project managed the steering committee, and we raised the money to get it going. $4 million in private funding and $4 million in public state funding. The steering committee spends its resources on the activities that are focused on scale, create equity of access, and prioritize cultural relevant ways of teaching. Our work centers on the districts, since they have become the unit of change. We operate under a theory of action that has 3 strong pillars: expanding on building the supportive context for environmental literacy, incrementally infusing environmental literacy into existing education initiatives and infrastructure, and proving out the benefits for this kind of teaching using select districts that want to be leading-edge exemplars. So, with this background, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about all of this from a state policy perspective.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, Commissioners. So as Will mentioned, I'm the Director of the Office of Education and the Environment at Cal Recycle. We're part of Cal EPA. So as I like to tell people, I speak environment to education folks, and I speak education to environment folks. It's a very interesting, I'm never quite at home in any room I enter. But I've entered this room many times, so I'm feeling more and more at home, and it's been wonderful to work with all of you. So just to provide a little bit of background and context to what Will was talking about, for years, as many of you probably know, environmental education, environmental literacy, these were terms only used intermittently, if at all, in education, in education quarters. And to the extent that it got any attention, it was always in competition with other subject matter. And as we all know, teachers, being a former one myself, have way more than they can ever tackle in any given day. And so it was always a losing battle. And the big shift in California came 13 years ago when the state decided to take a different tact. And that tact was to integrate, as Will alluded to. This idea that environmental literacy can be done as a part of science, as a part of history, social science, as a part of health. A lot of subjects lend themselves to teaching through this sort of lens. That's the lens, it's the world in which we exist moment to moment. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. And so in 2003, there was legislation passed. And first of all, that legislation called for the creation of a set of environmental principles. The big ideas that we want students to come away with, this idea of environmental literacy. Well, if we boil it down, what does it amount to? And I'll get to those principles in a moment, but just for some backgrounds, the State Board, Department of Education, our parent agency, Cal EPA, the Natural Resources Agency, and in fact, our office is kind of the lead in all of this, created those principles with Dr. Lieberman as the lead consultant on that effort. Back in 2004, they were approved by the State Board, and they received input from, just as this process is a very public process, this too was a very public process with input from academia as well as the private sector, and of course all of the subject matter and technical experts from the state. There are 5 principles. If you have taken a look at the history social science or the science framework or soon the health framework, you'll see what the 5 principles are. It's not so important that you or teachers or students memorize them. That's not the point. So what I've got here on the slide is just to boil it down to give you something that maybe you can carry with you. It really is essentially about the human relationship with natural systems, this idea that we are utterly dependent. Every breath we take, we are literally dependent on natural systems for our survival. Our actions influence those natural systems and their health. And of course, those interactions are very complex. And so we try to distill that down into 5 principles, and then we seek to integrate that into the teaching of various subjects. And it's amazing what a different slant you might get on a subject that you think you know well when you start to look at it through, and here I'll use the analogy of a prism. The nature of light takes on a whole different meaning when you view it through the prism. And in the same way, when you view some of these traditional subject matter through the EP&Cs, you get a very different take, and sometimes a very, very startling, awakening kind of take. We've noticed this with students, like Will was describing. There's so many issues that are part of our everyday lives that once connected to some of the traditional subject matter, for example, here's a picture of one of the EEI units, which I'll talk about in a moment, covering the gold rush. Well, if we view the gold rush through this environmental prism, there are all sorts of things, from the mercury that is still with us 150 years later to just the kind of pressures that were put on the natural environment and resources from the influx of hundreds of thousands of people to California. So there's a wonderful opportunity, and one of the other things that the law called for was for us to create a model curriculum. Okay, so we're taking this new approach, it's California. What does it actually look like? It's all well and good to say it can be done this way. So we were tasked, again, with working with the environmental agencies, the state education agencies, to put together a model curriculum and prove the point. That curriculum is known as the Education and the Environment Initiative curriculum. It came through this body back when Will Parrish was a part of it, and it ultimately went through the State Board and was approved in 2010. It's a model curriculum. It's not comprehensive across any grade, but it does have 85 different units, kindergarten through 12th grade, about half are history, social science, about half are science. It's now 8 years old and aging, but the history social science standards are still the same standards. Science has changed. My office is still, most of what we do is still putting this curriculum out and letting teachers know it's available, and that it embodies still to this day the model of what we mean when we say let's integrate environmental principles with state standards. And we make that available for free. It's posted online. We also have print copies that we make available to teachers. So those are kind of the first two parts, the principles, which we created, a model curriculum demonstrating what that would look like. And I'm gonna turn it over now to Dr. Lieberman to talk a little bit about the third part, which of course is going forward from a model curriculum, how do we get this embedded into future materials and into the frameworks?
Good morning, good to see you again today. I've been involved with this for a very long time, but my hair might have been a little different color, but the amount of it was about the same. Tom Torlakson, when he was in the Senate, passed a piece of legislation that was Senate Bill 373 in about 2000, because he saw this as a strategy for not only resolving environmental problems, but improving education. And we've maintained that strategy as we've gone along. Working with this body from the point when it was known as the Curriculum Commission, so I still work at what the name of it is some days, and the State Board of Ed, Natural Resources Agency and Cal EPA, as Brian said, we developed these environmental principles. And we've been working very closely with all of the education agencies since the beginning of this back in 2003. And I'm sorry, I really need to see where you are and what we're doing. Okay, got it. I do have brain function still. So it's really important, and it's been super beneficial for us to work with the education system on this throughout the process. And we started to see the shift in the state board's policies back in 2004 as they worked to develop those environmental principles and concepts. And now, as you're probably aware, the environmental principles and concepts were a required component of the history social sciences framework, and they were required in the Category 1 adoption criteria. They were also required as a component of the science framework and science adoption criteria. And now, as you've seen in the health framework, we've begun to fully integrate them throughout the framework. What the science framework states at best, as far as I'm concerned, the EP&Cs have become an important piece of curricular expectations for California students, and it's really all California students. So in the science framework, you will find that the environmental principles and concepts are thoroughly woven throughout. And you have seen the official Mobius strip several times, and you saw on Will Parrish's slide, we have the Mobius strip, and yeah, I put the little tree in there because, in fact, the way the framework speaks to this is that it is integrated in. So this is the way I envision, and in fact, the final editors of the framework talk about the EP&Cs as, in essence, a fourth dimension for NGSS. And you can see, and this is the way we look at this rope, is the way we look at it in science, history, social science, and in health. This is not a separate strand of that rope. This is intended to be integrated across the disciplines and across the practices in each of these disciplines. So the framework specifically speaks of going beyond the three dimensions of NGSS. And there are several key points in the science framework and really in the NGSS practices from the very beginning. And one of the statements of a key instructional shift in the NGSS is that we want students to explore real-world phenomena, and we want them to engage in science that is meaningful to them and their local communities. That's one of the three major instructional shifts that's identified in the framework in Chapter 1. In the Instructional Strategies chapter, we talk about those real-world learning experiences, problem-based learning experiences and projects, the environmental principles, but equally important is this idea of having students engage in problems that are meaningful to them, whether they're on campus or in their local community. And then, as you know, with the next generation science standards, that engineering design component is truly critical. And it's a way for students to apply what they're learning and use those engineering design practices to solve real-world problems. So in the phase 4 rollouts, the one that we completed last year, for example, the engineering design activity that's presented relates to a water issue, a local water issue. So it gives them a chance to apply what they're learning to the local world. In the history social science framework, we also were able to work with the team and integrate a number of references, both to the environmental principles and concepts and to the instructional strategies, and provided examples of how they connect. So this is a paragraph from the 6.8 chapter where you can see the specific kinds of connections that are being called for in the framework. Students analyze how relationships between humans and environments, including human-induced environmental changes and changes in technology, affect settlement and movement and diffusion of ideas, etc. So you will find that kind of connection throughout the history social science framework, because of course if you look at 6th grade, for example, where you see the exploration of ancient civilizations, there are standards that specifically call for students to understand, for example, why societies and civilizations were established near rivers. So it gives us a perfect opportunity to look for the interdependence of humans and the environment and how they affect it. Likewise, sorry, this is the old frameworks cover, but we've been able to work with the team on integrating the EP&Cs into the health framework as well. Thank you for your help with that, the whole CDE crew and the SMC as well. And we wanted to specifically identify connections, again, that would make real to the students issues and problems that affect them and that they could affect. So that brought in a number of examples related to environmental health and environmental justice. So again, in 7th to 8th grade section of the health framework, you'll find a classroom example cleverly titled, "Is That in Our Air and Water?" And the idea was we want to give students an opportunity to gather and analyze information about air, water, and noise pollution in their local communities. Again, reinforcing and working directly with those practices that Mr. Parrish talked about that allow us to integrate disciplines together, which is, of course, critical, and give them the opportunity to identify their own potential solutions. So that's what you'll find, and we continue to work with the rollouts in history, social science, and I'm sure we'll be invited to work with the health rollouts as well. And it's really been a very rich opportunity both to connect the environment and to engage teachers in the environment. And I know that firsthand. We're working with 5 districts around the state, in fact, in Southern California and another half a dozen districts up in the north, and helping them implement NGSS. We haven't started with the health, obviously, and we haven't started with the history social science connections, but helping them identify exactly how they might implement it. And what we've discovered is the environment is an easy entry point for the teachers. NGSS are complicated. So if we open the door through something they can see on their campus, their students can see on their campus and community, it makes NGSS real to them. So thank you.
So with that, we bring our presentation to a close. I want to thank all of the commissioners and State Board of Education members Strauss and Rucker for your time and attention this morning. We need the upcoming generations to be educated about the need to be supportive of policies that will promote healthy relations between humans and the environment. And because students like learning with the environment as context, it's way more than a twofer. It's about 10-fer, right? Better student outcomes, better for the environment, and so much more. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Will, Brian, and Jerry for taking the time to speak to us today. You're familiar faces, as you've mentioned in your presentation in this room, and it's because, that line really struck me, that environmental literacy is the connective tissue that's really connecting all these frameworks that we're working on, and the latest one is the health framework. And there's obvious connections to environmental literacy in that framework, as well as we heard about history and science that we've already seen. So, we have instructional materials adoption coming up, and then the health framework, and then we'll have health instructional materials to do after that. And EP&Cs are woven throughout those. So I think it's great that we're continuing to be mindful of how the environment weaves into all the disciplines that, in the frameworks that are rolling out and in the standards and the instructional materials. So thanks for taking the time to come and present to us and keep this important topic at the top of our minds as we move forward. Okay, so I think we're going to shuffle back. So we kind of move forward to item B, 6B on today's agenda. But now, just for everybody to follow, we're going to move back up to 6A. And so that's where we'll resume. So let me get that ready. And this is where we'll hear reports and take action from subcommittees from the work that we did yesterday. We're going to start with Commissioner Murphy-Corwin with the Ed Tech Committee.
Yes, good morning. As chair of the Education Technology Committee, it is my tremendous pleasure to recommend that the full Instructional Quality Commission approve the draft standards be sent out for the 60-day public review and comment period with the agreed changes.
I'll second that motion.
Great. So we have Commissioner Murphy-Corwin has moved and Commissioner Wu has seconded that motion. Do I need to read the text there? Okay. To recommend the full Instructional Quality Commission approve the draft standards be sent out for the 60-day public review and comment period with agreed changes. Is there any discussion? Okay. Is there any public comment on this item? Okay, seeing none, I call for a vote on the motion. All in favor? Aye. Okay, oppose? Abstain? Okay, motion passes.
Get the happy dance again?
Okay, let's see.
Me again.
Yep.
Me again. As chair of the Education Technology Committee, I would also like to move to ask the full Instructional Quality Commission to delegate to the chair and the vice chair of the Education Technology Committee the review and approval of the agreed upon changes to the draft standards, as well as any minor edits identified by staff or the writers. This means things like grammar, punctuation, word order, citations, before the draft standards are sent out for its 60-day public review and comment period.
I second.
Commissioner Murphy-Corwin has moved and Commissioner Diaz has seconded that we ask the full Instructional Quality Commission to delegate to the chair and the vice chair of the Ed Tech Committee the review and approval of the agreed upon changes to the draft standards, as well as any minor edits identified by the staff or writers, such as grammar, punctuation, word order, citations, before the draft standards are sent out for its 60-day public review and comment period. Is there any discussion? Is there any public comment on this item? Okay. Then I call for a vote on the motion. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Oppose? Abstain? Okay, motion passes.
Yay, again. Finally, as chair of the Education Technology Committee, I would like to move to recommend the full Instructional Quality Commission approve the survey questions for the online survey that will be posted along with the draft standards.
Is there a second to the motion?
There we go, second.
Okay, Commissioner Murphy-Corwin has moved and Commissioner Naditz has seconded that, we recommend the full Instructional Quality Commission approve the survey questions for the online survey that will be posted along with the draft standards. Is there any discussion? Is there any public comment? Okay, so I call for a vote on the motion. All in favor? Aye. Okay, oppose? Abstain? Okay, that motion passes.
Can I ask for future votes that you not only raise your hand, but you say aye as well for our listeners? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to go to Commissioner Wu.
As chair of the Health Subject Matter Committee, I am bringing 3 motions to the full commission today. First of all, I move that the Instructional Quality Commission approve the draft health education framework with the changes we agreed to yesterday as listed in the table of recommended edits to be sent out for the first 60-day public review and comment period. Oh, there's a bunch of switching going on. Okay.
Okay. Is there a second to the motion?
A second.
Okay, Commissioner Wu has moved and Commissioner Fairchild has seconded the motion. Is there any discussion? Okay, public comment? Okay, I call for a vote. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hands.
Aye.
And say aye. All opposed to the motion? Okay, the motion passes.
For my second one, I move that the Instructional Quality Commission delegate to the Health Subject Matter Chair, myself, and the Vice Chair, Commissioner Fairchild, the review and approval of the agreed-upon changes to the draft framework, as well as any minor edits identified by the staff or the writer, such as grammar, punctuation, word order, and citations, before the draft framework is sent out for its first 60-day public review and comment period.
Okay, is there a second to the motion?
I second the motion.
Commissioner Wu has moved and Commissioner Krishna has seconded the motion. Is there any discussion? Public comment? Okay, I call for a vote. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hands and say aye. Aye. All right. All opposed to the motion? The motion passes.
All right, and my third motion is I move that the Instructional Quality Commission approve the survey questions for the online survey that will be posted along with the draft framework when it is posted for its first 60-day public review and comment period.
Okay, is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Commissioner Wu has moved and Commissioner Chow has seconded the motion. Is there any discussion? Public comment? Okay, I call for a vote. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Right. All opposed to the motion? The motion passes. Okay. Now, do I need talking points? Or? Okay, we'll go to Commissioner Chow to hear a report from the Subject Matter Committee.
Thank you so much. First of all, I actually want to take a quick moment to say hello to my mom and to my oldest daughter, Olivia. Hello, hello. And now to
business. Did you guys know that your mom was such a rock star?
At this time, I would like to say that we need full commission approval for the instructional materials reviewers, IMR, and content review experts, CRE panel, and facilitator assignments. As co-chair of the Science SMC, I move to recommend the approval of the Instructional Materials Reviewers, IMR, and Content Review Experts, CRE, panel, and facilitator assignments, which were approved by the Science SMC earlier today, and to empower Science SMC co-chairs Bromelsik and myself to make necessary changes to the panel assignments if issues arise due to attrition or if any other unexpected complications develop.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Okay, so Commissioner Chow has moved and Commissioner Fairchild has seconded the motion to recommend the approval of the instructional material reviewers and content review expert panel and facilitator assignments, and to empower Science SMC co-chairs Bromelsek and Chow to make necessary changes to the panel assignments if issues arise due to attrition or if any other unexpected complications develop. Is there any discussion? Is there any public comment on this item? Okay, I call for a vote on the motion. All in favor? Aye. Oppose? Okay, abstain? The motion passes. All right. So. And now we're going to go here, right? Do you want to? Okay.
So we're going to go down to our presentation by West Ed, and I believe we have Eric Crane here. I'm hoping. No, not yet. All right, so we're not going to go there yet. So we're going to the original agenda, and we will take about a 10-minute break, Commissioner Chair, if that's okay, so that we can set up for our activity for science. Okay?
Hi, Cliff Rudnick again. Just so we know, we're actually going to start this presentation. Most of this presentation you'll still be at the dais so that if you have questions, our folks streaming can hear what your questions are as we go through. When we get to the activity, we're going to ask you to come down to the tables, but we're going to go ahead and set them up during the break.
Sounds good.
So we can resume at 10?
Sure.
10 a.m.?
Perfect. Okay. All right, everybody, let's come back from break. You want the gavel? All right. Okay, so we are going to have Cliff Rudnick and Brian Boyd give us a presentation on the science adoption criteria, science framework, chapter 13, to prepare us for our upcoming science adoption.
Yeah, so if I can just frame this for you as you come together. So we noticed when the history, social science, instructional materials adoption, our facilitators were very versed in the criteria because they had experience with facilitating the panels. And not every commissioner was a facilitator. So we want to make sure that all of our commissioners are very well versed in the criteria, because you will be looking to that criteria as you're making decisions and going through your deliberations for the science instructional materials adoption. So that is the purpose of this presentation and our activity.
Well, thank you. I'm going to say pretty much the same thing at the beginning, but that's cool. So as Dr. and thank you, Chair Reese and Commissioners and Executive Director Gregson for letting us do this with you this morning. We asked for some of your time today to discuss in some detail the evaluation criteria that was used by publishers to develop and will be used by reviewers to evaluate the materials that are submitted for this year's science adoption. As Dr. Gregson noted, even though many of you were here for the development of the framework, which the criteria chapter is part of the framework, many of you were not here for the development of that framework that was adopted in 2016. A number of you are going to participate as facilitators in the adoption process, and we will do training similar to this for the facilitators. However, a number of you will not have that opportunity. However, all of you at your September meeting this year will be discussing in depth the panel reports of findings that are presented to you. And so you will need to be very and intimately familiar with the criteria. So the criteria are the instrument by which submitted programs for the adoption are evaluated. Alignment to the criteria will determine whether the programs are adopted or not adopted by the State Board of Education in November of this year. And as you know, as I just mentioned, they are part of the science framework that was adopted by the State Board in 2016 as well. So I'm going to go right forward. And I'm also, I want to let you guys know ahead of time, so when we do get to the point in this presentation where we'll have you participate in the activity down here, I'm going to switch over to a handheld microphone, and I will use that when talking to you, but I will also be handing that to whomever you choose as your facilitators or your reporters for the activity, so that our folks who are listening or watching on the live stream can also hear the audio. All right? So the criteria are organized around 5 categories that are shown on this slide: alignment with the California NGSS 3-dimensional learning, program organization, assessment, access and equity, and instructional planning and support. Each program submission will be reviewed separately by one of 16 review panels, and each must cover the requirements in all 5 of these categories. And we'll talk about how they cover those requirements as we continue. So it's important to understand the expectation that only those programs determined by the reviewers to meet all the criteria in Category 1, and I do mean all. One of our former commissioners used to say all means all, and that's all means. So that it will come up at deliberations and training, so those who are serving as facilitators, be ready with that wonderful axiom. So including all the content standards. So alignment to the content standards is one criterion. It's one criteria statement. It's Category 1, criterion number 1, and Dr. Boyd will talk about that as he moves through his presentation as well. But in the other 4 categories, categories 2 through 5, each program must be determined by the review panels to have shown strengths in that category. So they may cover some particular criteria very well, and others not as well in those categories, as opposed to Category 1, where every criteria statement must be fully addressed. Okay? Make sure I'm on the right slide. So before we get into those specifics, let's take a look at the big picture of the criteria. We'll start with some guidance that you can use when interpreting the language of the criteria. When the criteria uses words such as, or phrases such as, or e.g., the items being referenced should be considered as examples. Okay? This kind of language doesn't actually appear that often in the criteria document itself, but you will encounter it in the standards and in the framework, okay, which are both included in Category 1 criteria, in that category, alignment to the standards and alignment to the adopted framework. You will want to read each criteria statement very carefully to identify everything required in that statement. In other statements, it will use the term including. It might say something like, you know, in a earth and space science class, middle school thing, that students will be able to understand and identify certain types of rock, and it might say including igneous, sedimentary, metamorphic. There are many more types of rock, but if it said including those 3, even if they listed 9, those 3 should be among the 9 that are studied by students. Okay, so that's different than such as, which is for example. Okay, reviewers will be cautioned, and you and I will train the reviewers together on April 17th through the 20th. The 16th, you all will meet with us. Sorry, but we were going to be very careful in that training about not reading into the criteria. We have had issues with panels for all types of content areas. The folks on these panels are teachers in the content area. They are passionate about, for this year, they're going to be passionate about science. They're classroom teachers who know what works in their classroom. And sometimes they want to say, I know this really works, and if it were in the materials, it'd be great, so let's add it to this criteria statement. The state board are the only folks who get to adopt criteria. I don't get to change them. Unfortunately, you don't get to change them. Only the State Board of Education makes a determination on what is adopted criteria. So you will find, as those of you who are serving as facilitators, what you will often be doing is asking the review panel to come back and reread the criteria with you. And the same thing will happen when you're looking at standards. You will ask them to come back and reread the standards with you. So we're going to give very specific examples and training to the reviewers in April, or later, in April. All right, so I want to cover that. Okay, so conversations during deliberations will be facilitated by many of you, and the adoption is supported by leadership team the executive director of the IQC, Dr. Grigson, the chair of this commission, Dean Reese, and your co-chairs for the Science Subject Matter Committee, Commissioners Chow and Bromelsek. Dr. Boyd, who is our lead consultant for the adoption, will also support all the panels. I will do my best to support all the panels. And one of the changes we made for history that worked out very well is we have our publisher liaison, David Olmquist, who works in our office, who also supports all the panels. So that will help as the publishers have questions. And if they want to approach you, you likely will want to call us or text. Everybody will have my phone so they can text me. And you'll text me and say, get David here, please. Okay? And David's listening to this, so he hears this. So while the reviewers will be the ones who ultimately interpret the criteria to evaluate the programs, IQC members and CDA staff will train them by bringing them to the wording of the criteria, the standards, and the framework. We'll be there at every stage of the process to ensure that everyone is receiving the same message. That's very critical that all the panels review each program in an equitable fashion. Okay? That's part of this process. That's why it's open to the public and very transparent throughout the entire process. As reviewers have questions, the publishers will be on hand to respond to a set of questions drafted by the panel for publisher response period. That's an actual set-aside time where they have formal questions, and they'll be there throughout the process, and at least twice a day the panel will hold public comment. Publishers will be in the room. A lot of times we tell panel members when they want to ask the publisher a question during deliberations or that's not appropriate, but you can say to the rest of your colleagues in the room, I wonder if there's any more examples of whatever, because the publisher is listening, and when it comes time for public comment, they will provide those additional examples. Okay. There we go. So you will notice as you read the criteria chapter that there are many criteria statements that are fairly broad in application. The question of how much is enough, that often comes up as people look at the content. As I said ago, it is ultimately the SBE adopted reviewers, SBE appointed reviewers who use their professional judgment to determine if a criterion has been fully met or if a standard has been fully covered in the materials. It is possible that public participation may affect the review, either at the panel level during deliberations or when the materials come to the Instructional Quality Commission in September or the State Board of Education in November. The IQC will have two opportunities to hear public comment. The first will be at the public comment meeting you specifically scheduled yesterday for the science adoption that will be on August 13th, 2018, and the second will be during your September meeting when you're discussing the programs. And that's when you will make your recommendations at that same meeting to the State Board. It's critical that you know the criteria well, as public comment may offer different interpretations of criteria. You'll have access to the public comment submitted during the entire process. So the public, we have an email account. They'll be able to comment, send us, and they send in mail, they send in emails, and we'll make sure that that public comment is formatted in a way for your digestion and review. Okay. We could just read all the criteria statements to you, but I guarantee you that would be exceptionally long and for some of you maybe even exceptionally boring. So instead, we will highlight some specific criteria, and then we're going to have you dive right into the criteria themselves as an activity. You should have been mailed a copy of the criteria. I brought some extras with me if you don't happen to have yours with you. When we come to the table, you'll bring those criteria with you because you're going to use them as part of the activity. So just let me know before we do that, because I brought a few extras. Actually brought 10 extras just to be safe. All right. So, and after the activity, we'll come back to the dais and we'll cover a few final issues related to the logistics of the review and take any final questions you may have at that time. Okay. So before I relinquish the podium to Dr. Boyd, who will take you through the 5 categories of the criteria, highlighting some that you will likely hear about during the public comment meetings, are there any questions for me so far? Okay, then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Boyd. You have your notes? Ready. All right. want them right now? If we need to make more after that, I'll make more after that.
It's in the tab in the agenda packet under full commission, if you're looking for it. Okay. So the chapter 13 at the top.
Yeah, it says chapter 13 at the top because it's right out of the frame. Our building falling apart.
All right, perfect. Thank you. My name is Brian Boyd. I'm the lead consultant for the 2018 Science Instruction Materials Adoption. And I just want to report on the evaluation criteria. Just to give you a quick overview, as Cliff said, we do have an activity for you. I just want to look back for a quick second. It was 5 years ago, 9 months ago, when I first started looking at the NGSS. In fact, when I first started, I made flashcards. There are so many acronyms, CCCs, DCIs, PEs. You may get a little bit overwhelmed, but we promise you we'll make this process as easy as possible. In fact, I'm working with county offices, and we actually have a placemat with all of the acronyms and everything, so it's really going to be really straightforward, and we'll just get into it. So thank you. The first part is the alignment of the NGSS, three-dimensional learning. That's one thing I'd like to highlight. With three-dimensional learning, you always meet, as the NGSS, you may hear this a lot. Looking at the different aspects of the NGSS. So just to let you know, just the most important thing I want to highlight is what we consider the standard. We say, what are the standards? The standard is the PE, the performance expectation. And then underneath each performance expectation, there are three dimensions. The three dimensions are the SEPs, which are the science and engineering practices. You have the DCIs, which are the disciplinary core ideas, and the CCCs, which are the cross-cutting concepts. So when we say standard, we say the PE and all of the foundation boxes or the three dimensions. So when we talk about three-dimensional learning, there's a huge shift. The shift is that in the past, we only had students, when I was a middle school science teacher, we had a lot of the kids just focusing on the disciplinary core ideas, the facts. Now it's more well-rounded. The students are actually engaging in science, and they're learning science by doing science. And that's what's so exciting about the NGSS. So let's highlight the category. Category 1 is called the gatekeeper. The reason why is for adoption, each program must fully meet every single criteria statement. There are 20 individual criteria statements. And I'm going to briefly go over these in this category. For Category 1, the first one is Category 1 Criterion Statement 1. It's talking about the resources, and that if you don't know, we are an adoption state for kindergarten through grade 8. And so you'll see that we have the standards, and they have to meet the academic content standards for those grade levels. We have these things called, we've provided standards maps, and each standard map will have every single individual standard that the publishers must have in their materials for adoption. But the important thing I want to highlight here, especially for Category 1, the statement number 1, is that we have two separate models. We have the preferred integrated model, and we have the discipline-specific model. And I think what's wonderful is for this opportunity is that the publishers submitted programs for both, so that there's more choice for local education agencies for them to decide what's best for their students and what's best for their districts, and they can actually choose from either or. But that's what's nice also, is that we have laid out specifically what needs to be in the integrated model and the discipline-specific model. And when I talk about integration, you'll hear about an integrated model, and we've been really, I think that's one thing that we've done, Cliff and I and Stephanie, Dr. Grigson, we've all come together, and with David, and we've created these webinars, and we've done a lot of professional development, professional learning for the publishers, because what's really important is that the NGSS is so different, and we want to make sure that they have all of the elements of the NGSS, but they truly understand what it means to be integrated. I think a great example that I like to talk about is landslides. If you look at landslides and you wanted to do an integrated unit, the landslide could be a phenomenon. It's something that the students could really get their hands on. It's something that they could see, wow, what's happening? So if you look at landslides, you have biology, or biological science or life sciences, right? You have the different types of water, you have the water cycle, you have vegetation that may be eroded away, and then that would also lead you to earth and space science about different types of rock and soil, and then you would look at the physical science, what the viscosity of the soil, why it's loose, or different types of soil, or the gravity, or you could do a lot of different things, and plus there's an engineering component. How can you mitigate the factors of landslides? So a true integrated lesson or unit could focus in on all of those dimensions all in one. And that's what we really wanted to convey to the publishers. We didn't want pulling just one unit here on life science and then one on earth and space science and physical science, and then you have them all separated, but putting them together in 1 year, and that's integrated. That's not true integration. And then we really wanted to make sure that publishers understood that. And then we also talk about the discipline-specific courses. The discipline-specific courses, and that sometimes if you're looking at a life science like grade 7 specifically, we'll look at, this is actually a grade 8. This is middle school, physical science 1-5. This is a performance expectations, talk about chemical reactions. And let's say that you're in a discipline-specific class. Well, sometimes you'll have to pull in these disciplinary core ideas, specifically for life science. You'd have to pull that in as a supplemental DCI to support what's going on or what the students are learning in the classroom. So that's what's we've also conveyed to the publishers, is to make sure that, yes, although it is a discipline-specific, domain-specific classroom, like for physical science or life science or earth and space science, you need to pull in other elements sometimes to make sure that the kids truly understand what's being covered in that performance expectation. So the next one I would like to highlight also is a three-dimensional sequence. That's what the Category 1 criterion statement 4 is, that it is a three-dimensional sequence. If you know from the past, specifically when we taught science, well, when I taught science, it was isolated facts. But what's really the foundation of the NGSS is that it is an instructional sequence, and it actually flows. There's a vertical articulation from the elementary level to the middle school to the high school, and all the learning builds on it, on one concept that they learned, and it gets more advanced and more complex. I also love that in kindergarten you have discrete, concrete things that children can actually have in their hands and hold, but then as they move on in middle grades or high school, it becomes more abstract, things that they can't see with their eyes. It's actually more abstract concepts. And that also teacher resources support instructional opportunities for assessment and engaging learning in three-dimensional learning. That's another huge component that's changed. And the fact I was really good at teaching science because I could introduce a concept. The next day we do a hands-on lab. Wednesday I could do vocabulary building. And on Thursday I could go over what's going to be on the assessment. Of course, on Friday was the assessment, and then I would move on. And this is radically changing how we're thinking about science, but also we're looking at teacher resources. How do we support those teachers to change their instruction and also learn how to assess that learning in the classroom? Now, this is another one that's really important that I want to highlight. In fact, I don't really read slides, but this one I'm going to have to read because this is so important. This is a criterion statement number 1.11. And it is similar to the history social science criterion 1.14. And we spend a great deal of time during the reviewer training. We'll talk about this and make sure that the reviewers truly understand what this criterion statement means. It is important that we bring our reviewers to the criterion statement themselves and do not attempt to amend, append, or the SBE adopted criteria. And this is an important one. We've learned that the interpretation of the criterion can lead to confusion and conflict. So let's take a moment to read this one carefully. And so I'll read this one for you, and then I'll propose some questions for you to think about. All right. So number 11 says resources include examples of people and groups who use their context, learning, and intelligence to make important contributions to society through science and technology from different demographic groups. Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, excuse me, sorry, and other Latino groups, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, European Americans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered Americans, persons with disabilities, women, and members of other ethnic and cultural groups. Resources emphasize the importance of science education to all members of our society in a way that is culturally and socially authentic. So that's a really powerful criterion, and we want to make sure that the reviewers understand it, and that I'm going to pose some questions for you. Does it say that materials need to include a representative from each and every group listed? Does the criterion say that representatives need to be labeled accordingly? Does it note at what grade level this content needs to be introduced? And does it say that this content needs to be at every single grade level? Okay, so these are excellent questions. And while the first question is debatable, since the first sentence says resources include, the other questions would be required adding additional language to the criterion and to produce a definitive yes. So we cannot, and panels should not, add language to the criteria. So let's pause for a minute. Are there any questions?
If your panel is doing a program that is only a single grade level and it doesn't have all of this, what do you do?
Yeah. Please.
So when the publisher submits a program, that program may be one or more grade levels. If their program is one grade level, they need to address this in their program, even if their program is one grade level. Now, if they submit a K-5 program or a 6-8 program, then some of the components of this particular criterion can be addressed at multiple grade, within the multiple grade levels. But a single grade level program still has to, that's the word, and that's their program.
So it's the words that you need to pay attention to is program versus grade level. Okay, so you have K-5 programs, you have 6-8 programs, you have 6-7 programs, you have fourth grade program. So within their entire program, this needs to be represented, not by grade level.
Commissioner Diaz?
Yes, this is all really near and dear to those of us that were part of the last summer. That's why we're asking all these questions.
No,
so.
that's one of the reasons we're doing
Yes,
this. As
thank you.
Dr.
I
Grigson
appreciate
said,
that.
That's why we're doing this training
Good,
today.
good. So one of the things I think last year that was, I know in some of the, if I remember correctly with some of the panels, what the poster that has this criteria, and it follows the column design of K 1, 2, 3, and you know how you have to do a consensus for each grade. What tripped the panels up was that it's almost like that row needed to be merged and not individual for grade, because the panels got very confused with, they thought it had to have one for K, had to have one for first. There was a missing X when they took that vote. I don't know if there's a way to...
There is, and that's an excellent suggestion. As we develop those tally sheets, as those posters are called, they have a criteria tally, and then of course they have the standards not met, that it's just a big blank sheet, because that can be that way. But I like the idea, if those of you who might have been around for ELA, ELD recall, there were some criteria that weren't applicable to a particular grade level in ELA or ELD, and we shaded it. But I like the idea of, because for those who don't know, the criteria are listed in a column on the far left coming down. So if there's a particular criterion that doesn't apply as an individual grade level for each one, that's a great idea to make that one cell going across. So we will absolutely.
And then that way you could just, as you have your facilitation, you could just write in the merge column, oh, it appeared in K, it appeared in 3, comma, it appeared, and then that way when we go back to vote, we can evidence that it was within the resources,
program.
not necessarily per grade. That was one suggestion.
That's an excellent suggestion that may mitigate some of that discussion. So, thank you. Oh,
along those lines, in the some of the panel that I was participating with, they were, I guess my question is, how do you answer how much is enough? I think that sometimes some of the panel members wanted more of a certain group represented within the content of the material, even though there was some.
Right.
But the panel was saying it's not enough. It's not enough.
So
What is enough?
bring them back to to the criteria statement itself. And in this particular criteria statement, it just says, let's read this again. Resources include examples of people. It doesn't say numerous examples. It doesn't say one example. It says examples of people. So there are some times where there might be a discussion that, hey, it says examples of, and this particular group was only mentioned once in grade 3 of this K-5 program, and I can, off the top of my head, name 15 people who contributed to science and technology in the development in California and the United States that I can name. And that may be a valid concern for the group, okay? But also as they make those comments that they say, I only saw this one example in grade 3, I wonder if there's other examples in any of the other grade levels or somewhere else in the program I didn't find. And again, as I mentioned, the representatives of the publishers are in the room with them. They will likely be looking to find more examples and at the public comment moment be able to say this. There is a distinction we need to make though, and we'll talk about this at the facilitator training as well, between I want to see more of something and I want to see something the way I think it should be presented or taught. Those are two different things. But the question will come up, are they just meeting a minimum threshold to meet the criteria? And to be honest, the answer to that question is yes. These are either met or they're not met. It's not met. There's no column that says not met enough. They're either met or they're not met.
And then may I also ask about labeling? I've seen materials where there are representatives of various groups, but they were not labeled as such. And I know that my panel was very passionate about wanting everybody labeled. What is the response?
So here's the thing with that. First of all, again, we bring them back to the criteria, and we'll bring you back to the criteria as well. If there's anything in the criteria statement that says, and it probably wouldn't say labeled, it would say identified, as belonging to a particular group, but that is not present here. Now, as has happened recently, the panel can say we would like this, and that was done not through not meeting a criteria, it was actually done through social content, saying that we don't feel they're represented unless it's noted that they're here, okay? So that's a discussion that then comes to the Instructional Quality Commission. And the Instructional Quality Commission will make a determination whether that's appropriate or not, and then the state board will have the opportunity to do the same, okay? So that occurs. Now, what we will be more careful with moving forward is also what meets the definition of a social content citation, because it is actually defined, and what meets the definition of an edit or correction. It's in regulations and what that is defined as. And we will try and be more thoughtful at the control panel room, which again will include 3 of your colleagues, the executive director and others, as we review those and have sometimes maybe go back to a panel and say, this really doesn't meet the definition of a social content citation or an edit and correction. It may be something you'd like to see, just like this isn't taught the way I'd like to teach it, but it isn't part of this review.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any more questions, or should I turn it back over to Dr. Boyd? All right.
All right, so the next one is number 14 will coincide with category 3 on assessments. I started talking about assessments a little bit, and that's going to be a radical shift from the past instruction materials. And again, we see here a little detail that may cause some debate. Note the necessity of helping these students to contribute with multiple elements that will appear in science instruction materials. While there's guidance in the framework, teachers' personal experiences can influence how they best see this coordination. And number 15 is important as well. You saw a presentation this morning on the environmental principles and concepts. I'd also highlight something here. It says that it's aligned to the NGSS, but there's also exemplified in Appendix 2. Our framework provides a wonderful thing that Jerry Lieberman, Dr. Lieberman created. And it was the Appendix number 2, and it shows for every performance expectation where environmental principle and concept may connect to and work, and it also provides some EEI units. So it was a really good resource. So during our webinars for the publishers, we always highlighted that. They said, hey, this is a good starting point. If you're not sure where to add the environmental principles and concepts, go ahead and go to Appendix 2. It provides exactly where they're good fits. Also with our printed document, our printed standards. If you didn't know, we do have printed version of our standards. That was a really great thing for our science community and our science teachers. And within there's an asterisk, and it shows where the environmental principles and concept, where it ties into the performance expectation. So we provide a lot of guidance for the publishers. It is a very important thing that we need to have in the instruction materials, but we've provided a lot of support for publishers so they're not just guessing where to put it in. We've outlined it as the suggestion on where a good fit would be for them to add that into the materials.
The question is the as exemplified in Appendix 2, does that mean that everything that's in Appendix 2 better be in the program, or is that one of those such ases?
Exemplified means example.
Okay.
It's examples. Okay. And I believe that's what we told the publishers during our webinars, is that it's a resource. All right, program organization. We're now moving into category 2 through 5. So the first category I said are the stakeholders, like those ones you have to be in here, and if you don't, then your program won't pass. But now we're moving into categories 2 through 5. 2 through 5 are strengths of the program. And for category 2, calls for materials that are organized to include a coherent instructional design that provides structure with students and how they should learn each year, and allows teachers to teach content efficiently, effectively. And as I said that before, it's important because that's the way that the standards are designed. It is an articulation from the low grade levels, and it builds and builds and builds. And so you need to see that program organization in the materials and make sure that teachers can follow it, and also they could see where the kids were and where they're headed. So it's a really important part of the programs that for the criterion. And I also want to highlight there is no specific time requirement. Programs should also provide instructional content for 180 days of instruction. And I'm not going to go over every single one, but I'd like to provide an overview. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and contact me or Cliff. Next one is assessment, category 3. Category 3 calls for multiple measures of assessment and student performance and progressing towards mastery of the skills and content called for in the standards. And that's another shift. If you looked at our framework and you're aware of it, that was the number one change that we had from the second 60-day field review from the first to the second. There was a major shift, a paradigm shift that teachers have to have. They can actually use the science and engineering practices to assess NGSS learning and what the students are producing. If you know from looking at the standards, PEs are performance expectations. It's what the students are doing. And now the teachers can take on the role, an NGSS hat, put it on, and look at the classroom and start to use those practices to assess what the students are doing. So category 3 calls for multiple measures of assessment. I'm going to highlight some of these in category 3. You can see on the screen there's a list of them, from entry level, learning, summative. And as though these are strengths, they have to have them. But I'm sure if a program does not have summative assessment, it probably will not be recommended, right? Especially with the NGSS students building towards mastery of the performance expectation. So that's important. Those are key types and purposes of assessment that need to be in the instructional materials and strengths of the materials. Category 4 is on access and equity. I think another thing I'd like to highlight, if you don't know about the NGSS, is there's a huge shift in making sure that it meets all the needs. It's all standards for all students, and it's including women and young women in science. There's been a huge lack in women in STEM careers. It's important to have that, and also that this access and equity category will make sure that it will be instruction for all students, including all students, and supporting them. Although you may not necessarily see that in the instructional materials, sometimes you will like highlight it of a important or key astronaut or physicist or some type of a career. You'll notice that in the instruction materials for access and equity, that's where it's going to be really important. Those access and equity, I mean the instructional strategies materials, the teacher editions, all of those are really going to contain the access and equity components to support teachers as they're delivering instruction. They'll be able to look at and know how to meet the needs of their students and kind of help them out. If they have a struggling learner, they can come right alongside them and support them. And that was a really important key component of that. And we also have Chapter 10 of the California Science Framework. California Science Framework provides a great overview of how to support students. And once again, we let the publishers know that we do have a framework, and it's Chapter 10 to take a look at that. And when you're building your materials and your courses, make sure that you provide support for teachers and supporting the needs of all students, because the NGSS is for all students, all standards for all students. The next one is the Category 5. It's instructional planning and support. This is there's 21 statements in this category. Again, it's 180 days of instruction. Teachers should understand the objectives of three-dimensional learning for each presentation activity, and activities additionally should support teachers in explaining these objectives to parents. I think that's a huge component of the NGSS also, is with this huge shift and this change in instruction, change. We also need to pull in the key stakeholders, and those are our community members and our family members, and making sure that teachers have a way to connect with those parents to make sure they understand what's happening in science, that students are actually learning science by doing science. And then also, teacher resources should offer substantial suggestions for extended learning opportunities like field trips, including museums, visits, virtual field trips, or just different things and activities, and just providing also not only in-class instruction, but how to take the kids from going inside a classroom environment to going to outside and getting outdoors, and there's some really good guidance there for that. So that was Category 5, and now I'm going to turn it over to Cliff. I hope you understand the categories a little bit clearer. There's categories 1 through 5, and thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Cliff.
Okay. Hey, this is working. Wonderful. So that was speeding through the criteria by Brian Boyd. What I'd like to ask you all to do now is go ahead and come on, bring those criteria with you. We've set up 3 tables down here. I believe there are 14 folks here, so we have 14 chairs around the tables. So take a minute. If you need to take a quick bio on your way there, that's fine. And then I'll go over the activity with you right here. When you're at the tables, you'll still be able to see the screens on the side, so you won't be missing your TV in front of you.
Cliff, what
Yes.
do they need to bring with them?
The criteria.
All right, thank you.
That says chat.
And a pen
You
or
can,
pencil,
yeah,
yes.
if you want to do some writing. All right. Going to set this right here for a moment. Oh, you want it? So right now, all they need is the instructions. Hold on to the other 2 documents. Thank you.
Yes, understood.
Okay, so if everybody, when you get settled, I set down a stack of instructions on the table there. If you could pass those out, they're identical. Everybody gets the same instructions at all 3 tables. And, I guess I'm showing on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read those. I'm going to step over here for a moment just so the folks who are streaming can hear what the instructions are. So after you get settled into groups of 5 or so at the tables, you're going to use a set of mock publisher questions. So our staff now it's up on the screen. Our staff receive publisher questions daily. David Almquist has a full-time job as a publisher liaison, and it's probably more than a full-time job. So you're going to have those questions like we receive. You have your criteria with you, and after I give you the questions, we're going to take about 20 minutes, and we're going to look at the questions, and you guys don't have, I'm not giving you, no table will have the same questions as another table, so looking over is not going to help you. So, but the whole group at your table will have the same questions. So I want you to do two things for me before you get started on the questions. I want you to figure out who in your group is going to serve as the facilitator when you start discussing the questions, and who in your group is going to serve as the reporter when I ask you to report out at the end of the activity. Okay, and then following this activity, after we report out, we'll go back up onto the dais, and I'll just cover a couple of logistics things, and then we will and Brian will cover a couple of logistics things, and then we'll take final questions then, okay? So let me hand you the questions. So here's your sets of questions. Those are the instructions that I handed you, and then, yeah, everybody got the instructions, and now I'm handing you the questions, and Brian's handing out, so here's your questions for your table. And I'm going to give you guys about 20 minutes. So at about 5 after, I'm going to come bug you again. And if you have questions, just grab Brian or I. I apologize for the dead air, those of you who are going to be watching. If you want to see what we answered, now you guys can have those, and then we're going to look at those. So Brian Boyd and I just handed you what the CDE staff, how we answered those questions, and they're also on our frequently asked questions webpage. So you have those, and I'm going to give you a minute to look at those, and then we're going to have someone at your table report out how the process went for you or what you might have learned, just a quick 1 minute each, and then we'll go back up to the dais and finish up. We'll talk about it again.
Including or all, or
It's
such as? Because the Q&A says like LGBT must be. This doesn't say must.
so. Oh, actually, yeah. Okay, I'll talk about it. Okay, so we're going to get ready to report out. Before we do that, what I want to point out to you guys is that you had 20 minutes to do this, and I realize you couldn't get through all the criteria in 20 minutes. Nobody was anticipating you could. In terms of our CDE staff responses, we've been going deeply into these criteria since they were adopted in 2016 and actually during the framework development process 2 years prior. And reviewers who have been already told once they were appointed by the board, please become very familiar. We sent them the link to the framework and the criteria, but they also will have, 6 or 8 weeks to be doing this, at home. So, 20 minutes, that's pretty phenomenal. I heard a couple folks excited about having the same or similar answers, and so that's really good. Okay, so I'm just going to start at this table since I'm standing here. Who's your reporter? All right, so just give us an example of something cool you learned doing this.
Something cool. We were not sure about question number 5, which is, do we have to include the full text of the content standards in our student textbook? What if we put them on the website? So we looked and we thought perhaps we might have missed it, but we came to the same conclusion, which is it's not here. And so then the question, trying to reconcile that with what you were saying earlier, is that then left to the publisher?
Yes.
Okay, just.
So that's a really good point. There's a lot of things in the criteria that the publishers will make the decision on where or they are presented and how they are presented. And that's actually important because we want to have the state board have an opportunity to adopt a number of programs that give districts options to purchase and implement materials and programs in their schools that meet their students' demographic and socioeconomic requirements rather than boilerplate. For those of you who have been around for frameworks, it's always one of the issues we run into when we put vignettes and snapshots in the framework and then see them all in the materials. And it's like, no, those are examples. You need to create things that are unique to you. All right, so I'm going to go over to this table. Who's reporting? Oh, Commissioner Diaz.
Thank you. So basically, our group pretty much, went through each of those areas, those sets, and identified pretty much on point. I think there were a few areas where we went back to that online, are the materials available online? Is that something that is Williams compliant? Some conversations came around that. But again, keeping back to providing those local control options for districts, and our job is just to whether or not it's there in the criteria and the publishers have direction or not. Let's see. So do you want to go to each one of these?
Just pick one and go.
Yeah. So basically, that's where we had that one. So it's number 4, online. That's where we had kind of the most conversation about. Is it okay for a California publication to submit online materials? And so again, we talked about Williams. We talked about different aspects of that, and we found it within the narrative of page 1 of category 1 that they were eligible to apply those, as well as in supporting documents.
Yes, and actually, moving back to the mathematics adoption in 2014, for those that haven't been around, we did math in 2014, ELA, ELD in 2015, history, social science in 2017, we're on science. But going back to math, I started to see more and more, if not digital programs themselves, at least a component, it might be the assessments or whatever, were a digital environment, even if it was a print program. And moving forward, getting to history, social science, we saw a lot of digital, web-based or CD-ROM-based materials, digital environment materials. And there are some states, like South Carolina as an example, that they have gone completely digital. There are no printed materials in South Carolina. So I just know that because that's where my family is. So before this last group reports out, I do want to cover one more thing because I was listening in and Letty Krause actually came and approached me. So there's still a little bit of confusion about criterion 1.11 that lists a number of groups. And if you remember, Dr. Boyd talked about it does say including, and the colon can be interpreted as including the following, but it's within the whole program. But I also want to specifically address the issue, and I'll just abbreviate, of LGBTQ, okay? And the reason I'm addressing that issue is there are commas separating those. They're not ors. It says they need to have examples of lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgendered, okay? So, and this was an issue for those who were around for history, where they said, well, they have these, but there wasn't nowhere in their program if they talked about a transgendered person, and it is in the criteria. So when you're at your table, someone is likely to say, I don't see somebody who's in this group. That's no different than saying, well, it says Mexican-American and African-American, can it be one or the other? No. Okay, so, all right, so let's have this report out.
Well, besides the fact that time really flew, I can't believe that was 20 minutes. We were really engaged in this process. One of the things that we had a really good discussion about was, our question was, do we have to include assessments for other standards besides the NGSS in the program, such as the California Common Core standards? And it's clearly stated in 3.8 that while the assessments don't have to be specific to other standards, the student written responses should be consistent with the grade level writing and mathematics requirements for the California Common Core standards.
So I want to thank everybody for indulging us in doing this. I think we, as a group, got to see some fascinating discussions, which was great, as well as I think it gives us a little insight into the complexity of what we're asking some teachers and other education professionals to do over the course of their summer. Remembering, of course, that like you on this panel, they're volunteers. They're not getting paid for this, folks. That's what I said, just like the people right here on this panel. And I know one person in the room who's actually volunteered to do this twice as a reviewer and loved it so much she became our director. So, so why don't we go ahead and move back up to the dais, and when we get there, Dr. Boyd is going to talk about those standards and criteria maps that he discussed a little earlier. Yes, you can leave the extra stuff on there. I'll clean up the tables. While you're moving up there, I'm going to clean up here. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Right now I'm going to go over the standards map really quick just to give you a quick overview. Earlier I said I would show you a quick slide of it, but I'd like to take a moment just to explain how they look and how they work. They are completely different than any other standards maps that we've created before. And if you can see, I kind of said before that when we say standard, the standard is the performance expectation, and then it's all of the SEPs, the DCIs, and the CCCs that are associated with that performance expectation. So you can see here on the first column, it has SEP, the DCI, and CCC. So the publisher will place citations in there of where they feel that it is located in their program. And then as the reviewers are going through, they'll take notes. And especially if they see it somewhere else, they can take notes to see for more evidence of where they found it. And you'll see in the middle, it says standards met, yes or no. So they will check yes, yes, yes if they see that it has been met. And then the far right column, it says LS 5, LS 1-1. That's a 5th grade life science standard, performance expectation number 1. And they'll also have the citations. Now there may be the citations may be a duplicate, but it just shows that over time, possibly in their program, how the performance expectation is going to be met. And then also next to it, you'll see standard met, yes or no. So for this program, especially for this performance expectation 5 LS1-1, they would have needed to met the SEP, DCI, CCC, and the performance expectation. So we're asking a lot of the reviewers, but also of the publishers, to make sure that every single component of every performance expectation is located in the standards. It's important. All right, the next thing I'd also highlight is an evaluation criteria map. The evaluation, the criteria map, so you know that 1.1, category 1 criterion statement number 1 is meets for all of the standards, but then you'll also see here for 1.2 and then 3, and then there's the other ones. So this is the criteria map, and then you'll have you'll have the publisher citations, and then you'll have the reviewer comments. Like I said before, they may take notes, they may see it in other places, or make notes of social content, things that they see throughout the program. They're able to note it in this evaluation criteria map. So, and this looks similar for categories 1 through 5. So we wanted to show you a quick overview of what the publishers are filling out and providing to the reviewers, and then the reviewers are taking those and then saying yes or no if it has met the standard. Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And like that, he was gone. He needed to throw down the thing that has the cloud of smoke come up. So I wanted you guys to have an opportunity to see what it is you're going to be receiving from the panels in September when you have your discussions, those of you who are not part of the actual process. I apologize, I keep losing my voice. I don't know why. I was hoping it would hold out today. Anyhow, so this is an image of what a report of findings document looks like, and this is just showing category 1. It's a multiple page document. It will have an area for each of the categories, and it will have whether the category was met, it does meet or does not meet, and it will have citations. If it's met, it will have exemplar citations. If it's a K-5 program, it will have an exemplar from at least one from at least each grade level. If it's not met, it will have everywhere it was not met. And that's really critical for you, for the state board, for the reviewers to understand that you don't give examples of where things are not met, because the publisher, as they should, will attempt to mitigate those issues. If the panel finds 50 items, 50 standards that are not met in category 1, and they cite one of them as an example, and the publisher was able to mitigate that and say, well, actually it is, and come to the IQC and say, actually, it is in the program, and it's in the program that was submitted to the panels. We didn't list it as a citation, but here it is. And you look at it as a commission and say, oh, yes, we think it's covered. Then that resolves that entire category because the panel failed. And we give them very clear direction in this regard that they need to cite, if it's not met, everyone. In addition to the categories, there'll be a section that will actually have a pre-modeled table for them this time. For the first time, we're doing pre-modeled tables for both edits and corrections, and then another one for social content standards. For those of you who were on the commission this last year, social content is not going to be separate documents. They will be included in a table, already in a table format within this report. Okay, and we already have a template set up for that. So we're trying to mitigate some of the confusion that took place with how edits and corrections and social content were discussed. It wasn't about whether or not they were appropriate. It made the discussion harder just to have everything in different formats. So we're trying to be more consistent for you. Okay, so again, you're going to come back here in September. You'll get reports of findings from each of the 16 panels. You'll get multiple reports of findings from most of the 16 panels. And even if there's a panel that ends up with one program, you may still get 2 reports, because if they decide one grade level passes or doesn't pass another, or they want to recommend one and not recommend another, they actually do 2 reports. You will never have a report that has both recommended and not recommended in it. It will either be a recommended report or a not recommended report. If the entire program is recommended or not recommended, it will be one report. Okay? Just want to make that clear. So you will have lots to review. You will have them prior to the meeting, obviously, just like you get any materials ahead of time. They will be posted because they are public documents. So as soon as any final editing is done following the deliberations in July, those get posted, the panel reports of findings. All right, so here's the big thing. The big key points I hope that we were able to get across today to all of you and to anybody listening out there is that this process is designed to be equitable for all the participating publishers. That's why we work really hard to make sure that our facilitators are all trained the same, our reviewers are all trained in one room, the public is, just like these meetings, they're all open to the public. There's time set aside for public comment each day, and so we want the public very involved. It needs to be transparent, okay? We also are hoping to do this so that moving forward, and not that the past hasn't been, but we want to make sure that this process is an enjoyable experience for all the reviewers, the commission, the public, our state board members when it gets to that level, and the publishers as well. So right now, I can take any final questions if you have them, or anything on this. Commissioner Diaz.
I have one. So after the report of findings, then the public continues perhaps to give input into the process, including the publishers. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is, and this is just for new facilitators, what happens is that as a facilitator of your program, when you come in September to vet that public comment, you're actually reviewing the public comment, and the expectation is you do that ahead of time so that when you come, you're able to cite evidence of where it lives in the public comment, what public comment to submit to the commission to consider as part of the process. And so one thing that came out was some of the folks that were emeritus members, and it fell on the chair, to then review a lot of that content. And it was overwhelming to do that. So what I would respectfully recommend is that the facilitator remain engaged in the process and complete the form, since they have that firsthand knowledge of what had occurred, and then perhaps submit that form either to the chair or to the chair of the science committee, subject matter committee, so then that at least there's some of that research that's been done before, because otherwise that one person's reviewing perhaps thousands of comments.
That's certainly, right now we have one emeritus commissioner participating, Commissioner Foster, and I'm sure that's a request he'd be open to. When it's determined who this person who will ever replace Commissioner Mueller, absolutely make the same request. I'm glad that you stated that from the way you did as someone who's done this before, because that's something that I think I should do in all of these types of activities, which is, are there any other folks who've served as facilitators and took part in the discussions for history or ELA before that, as a commission, who would like to help our new commissioners with some other tidbits of wisdom?
I don't know if they're wisdom, but I can share my experience, and I had an excellent experience. It was in LA. It was with the ELA, ELD, and it was not only provided an insight into the process of what the evaluation criteria is and what components are necessary when establishing a credible program, but it really gives you an opportunity to go through this democratic process of listening to your panel and sort of listening to what they have found and how you can, as a facilitator, really come to a compromise to bringing everybody's voice. And sometimes you're going to have opposing viewpoints, but then bringing it back to what is the question that it's really at hand, as far as what is the evaluation criteria, what is that component that needs to be included, and does that program really support that component? So it's always just bringing the panel back to that. What really also helped me was having the CDE staff support me in my journey when I took the panel through this, and they are just so well versed, and they're just there to support you. And so I just never felt like I was out there alone doing this. So just that considerable support was great. So if you're a brand new person, brand new commissioner about to engage in this, it's going to be awesome.
Yes.
I'd like to add to what was already said, but also to two things to just be aware of. You may find that you have panel members who have some very specific agendas that no one was aware of. And I think in those cases, please, what I would say to someone, please do not hesitate. Talk to the members of the CDE staff. Don't feel that in any way, shape, or form, if you go and ask for support or assistance, that this is showing weakness on your part or an inability to facilitate. The other that I'm certain will occur when we have the training with the panel members is that I'm positive that the CDE staff will explain their role, because some members of some panels expressed concern every time a CDE person would walk into our room. They wondered what that person was there for, and why they were taking notes, or why they were there to begin with. And it almost got into, in some cases, is this big brother, and they're trying to control what we're saying. Yeah. So I'm very confident that your role as CDE staff will be explained, and that people should not fear. if you walk into a room.
We try not to scare people away. We really try not to scare people.
I do understand that there was a perception, even though the CDE staff were trained and we were well aware that our purpose was to clarify, not to intervene, but I know that it was perceived at some times that having CDE staff come into the room was an intervention, which it is not an intervention. We are there to support your work. We are not there to intervene and provide input into your work.
And we'll be talking about this further as it gets closer to the deliberations and your role and everything. We'll make sure that you're very well versed and prepped and ready to go for your deliberations time. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Reese.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in less than a month, we'll be meeting our panelists, right? And you're going to want to, for those of you who haven't done this before, you're going to want to learn everybody's name and really get to know that group, because you're about to kind of go through a process that's lengthy. It's a 2-week process. There's the first week of just, learning how to be a reviewer. And then there's the actual week of deliberations where all your reviewers are reporting their findings, and you're tallying and facilitating all of that. One thing that I watched, who is it? Chair Wild. Chair Wild would basically bring candy and create this the most welcoming. Chair Wild as a facilitator is a thing to be seen, because she just makes you feel like family and just welcomes you and did a fantastic job kind of making everyone feel at home. And I learned from that. So, the first day, we were down in LA for the ELA, ELD, and then a bunch of commissioners went out. We just bought candy and tried to recreate what we saw former Chair Wild do. And she's remarkable. So, I think that's really important.
Rapport.
Yeah.
She built rapport with her panelist.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw modeled.
Absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is, we're not there to influence this process. They're reviewers for a reason. They've been selected to come do that. They're experts in their classrooms and at their schools and at their sites, and we're there to kind of just help them report their findings on a program.
So it's funny you should mention the candy and just it's team building and making relationships happen at the training that carry over into deliberations. And what's always a highlight for me is when panel teams show up at deliberations in matching shirts. They've had panel shirts made, with sayings on them, panel 2 for here for you or whatever. And it's actually pretty funny. But they do, just warning you ahead of time, that happens. Any other questions for me? Okay, then I'm turning this back over to Chair Reese.
Well, yeah, thank you, Cliff and Brian, for taking us through that training. It was great. I know we all learned, and I think when we're put in the shoes of, because we just felt like reviewers right there, right? And so now we're about to meet the reviewers that we'll be facilitating, and I think we'll have a better kind of feeling about what that feels like to be a reviewer now, and that's always good to keep that in mind. So thank you so much. That was great. All right, so. Sure.
All right, so I'm going to introduce our last presenter. Our last presentation for this afternoon is Eric Crane from West Ed. He is going to be presenting to you the presentation that the State Board of Education has seen regarding our California standards implementation and what our teachers are saying. Basically kind of what your colleagues are saying. And the reason why I've asked Eric to present this today is because of all of the work that is coming up around standards. We have our world language standards, our visual and performing arts standards, and our computer science standards. So just giving you insight as to what kind of guidance and support we can provide within our standards and our frameworks moving forward around standards implementation based on data. So Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Chair Reese, distinguished commissioners, board members Rucker and Strauss, good morning. I'm Eric Crane, and I have the honor to pinch hit for my colleague Robert Sheffield, who directs our California initiatives for the Center for the Future of Teaching and Learning. Along with my colleague Reno Makinen, I co-direct California's implementation of the Measure to Learn and Improve initiative. This is a Bill and Melinda Gates funded initiative that I'll talk about a little bit later. And in addition to that initiative, we have, it's been going for a couple of years, we have our 2018 offshoot of that work, the Measure to Improve network. When this material came before the State Board in November 2017, Board President Kirst introduced it saying, you know, we hear a lot about accountability, but much less about the capacity building for our teachers. And so building on a lot of work that we've done the last few years, I hope to kind of inform that and share what we've learned across WestEd. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with talking about the different initiatives that we've got going at WestEd. What we're seeing in terms of changes in teacher professional learning. One of the big headlines is that teachers report greater involvement in key school decisions. I'm also going to talk about their reported needs from the survey and focus group work, progress in these areas, some of the shifts that are happening, and I'll close with talking about some of this 2018 work. And I'll probably spend a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes on each of these topics. So since 2015, WestEd has been the California data partner for this Measure to Learn and Improve initiative. This is a multi-state, multi-year project that is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we've brought preliminary findings to the board a couple of different times. Once in March 2016, where we had some survey results from the early part of the 15-16 school year. And then again, as I mentioned, in November, where we brought results from the 16-17 school year. In addition to California, some of the other states involved are large states like New York, Massachusetts, and Florida, and some other states like Tennessee that are seen as leaders in this area. One thing that's important to point out about the survey work from the 15-16 school year to the 16-17 school year is in that first round of surveying, not just California, but a lot of the other states had a low response rate in the work. And so Gates made a change in terms of how this work would get done for the 16-17 school year. They moved to a panel approach, partnering with the RAND Corporation. RAND has an existing American teacher panel. This is a fixed set of teachers that can respond to surveys, and what that allows is more stability and higher response rate. So there's more of an ability, and we'll see this as into this next year's data as well, but more of an ability to make stronger inferences over time. One thing about this panel is that it is stratified and balanced by grade span, subject area, school size, poverty status, and so it gives us a pretty good look at what teachers in California think. In the 16-17 school year, the ATP sample had 798 California teachers, of which 479 responded. So we're talking a response rate of 60%, and for this kind of instrument, that's pretty good. What it means, though, is that when I talk about some of the survey numbers coming up, you can think about that as having a plus or minus 4.5 percentage points on some of these numbers. So you can keep that in mind as we share some of that data. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from a knowledge brief that my colleagues Reno Makinen and Robert Sheffield wrote. And what this brief is, California Standards Implementation, what educators are saying. What this brief did was it looked across a number of WestEd projects. I've already mentioned the survey data, but there's a lot of other things going on, and these links that you see on this slide are places to go and find more information. So through the Center for Future in Teaching and Learning, Robert's work with California initiatives, he and his team have gone out to a pretty wide range of school districts and conducted interviews and focus groups with teachers and principals. So that's been one rich source of information. The California Comprehensive Center, our colleagues there have worked with the CDE on the development of the local indicators, including standards implementation for the local control funding formula work. WestEd evaluated Math in Common. We've worked with Leading with Learning, an initiative focused on educating linguistically and culturally diverse students with the new standards. And then we are the home of the federally funded Center for Standards and Assessment Implementation. So we have some sources through there as well. Besides what's on the slide, I learned recently that one of my colleagues, Neil Finkelstein, is writing a chapter on standards implementation for the upcoming reboot of Getting Down to Facts. And I know that Neil and Robert have been supporting Success's communities of practice with a standards implementation focus. We also participate in CalSTAN, which is the California Standards Technical Assistance Network, a group that's committed to high quality standards implementation, and they've had a focus with English language development. So there's really a lot of sources from which to draw. And with that, I want to move into some of what we're finding. So from the survey work, we found that from last year to this, we've seen an increase of a 2 to 3 percentage points in teachers reporting more work with their peers. They're discussing standards in instruction more, making instructional choices, making choices about assessments and curriculum, developing materials and activities as well. They're also, and this is a pretty nice uptick from 45% to 54%, report observing another teacher's classroom. That is a trend that we know from the research is likely to be more effective. And it really represents a change from, say, 15 or 20 years ago. You kind of have centralized rollout, whether it was the centralized accountability at the start of No Child Left Behind. That in turn led to centralized PD, a lot of sit and get, which again, the research literature tells us it's not as effective as getting in and getting to collaborate with your peers. Another finding, I want to draw your attention to these three bars. One thing about this panel approach in the 12 states is that it gives California an opportunity to do a little bit of benchmarking against the other states. And I want to emphasize that there were not a whole lot of changes in lots of the questions. California and the other states were more or less in line. But one area of the survey where California differed from the pack was this sense of comfort with the standards and sense of influence and agency at the school sites. A pretty consistent 6 or 7 percentage point gap in California's favor on these items. So I feel comfortable voicing my concerns in this school. You can see 76% of California teachers would agree with that statement versus 69 for the set as a whole. Agree with the statement, teachers have a lot of informal opportunities to influence what happens here at the school, and teachers are involved in important decisions in the school. So on all three of these, again, that 6-7 percentage point spread, in a context where a lot of things were very much in line and there weren't many differences. Now, we are eagerly waiting for the final touches to be put on a data visualization tool that part of this Gates work is supporting. It's not something that we're running out of WestEd, but it is something coming from the larger project, a tool called Bento. And when that's available, it should be a pretty open portal for folks to go in and to be able to play with the survey data and visualize it in different ways. So have high hopes for that. It's running a little bit behind schedule, and so we kind of have been waiting for it for a while, very eager to see what it actually can deliver once it's in place. With apologies for cramming a bunch on this slide, I wanted to have here the specific school policies that we have reports on. And there's a couple of things to draw from this graph. One is that you can see on all of these, you can see California kind of outpacing the balance of the MLI states on all of these different specific policies. And you can also see the trend. We've sorted them here from highest to lowest in terms of these policies. So teachers report having influence determining books and materials that are used in their classrooms, 65% of California teachers. Setting standards for student behavior, 64%. And determining how student progress is measured, 59%. So those are sort of the big three in terms of the California teachers' response. Then there's a little bit of a drop-off, and the remaining four categories, between 40 and 46% of teachers indicate that they have influence there. But again, you can see this outpacing of the other states. And in particular, apart from that first row, the materials question, the remaining policies here, even down to the lowest one where only 40% of California teachers say they influence the planning of how funds are used. It's pretty consistent, about 12 percentage points on average that California outpaces the other states. Now, the other way to look at this slide is, why aren't all these numbers closer to 100%? Right? Because these are all good practices and things that teachers ought to be doing. So as positive as this message is, I think you can also draw from this slide the message of there is more work to be done. So teachers also report the strong role of teacher leaders, with about 2/3 of teachers agreeing that their school cultivates teacher leaders in implementing the standards, and particularly that role of shaping instructional practice in the classroom. What do these teacher leaders do? They provide expertise and guidance during collaboration. 68% agreed with that. They can guide other teachers with respect to materials, tools, or equipment that help teachers collaborate more effectively. 64% agreed with that. My colleagues Rebecca Perry and Deb Sigmund are leading work that gets down to the local level, and some of their findings include that teachers on special assignment have been sharing demo lessons and have been leading learning and helping to facilitate networks within the schools. So this is kind of underscores the critical role of teacher leaders at the school. Transitioning to what teachers say they need, teachers were asked to select the 5 things from a much longer list than what you see here, the 5 things that they need most to help advance standards implementation. And maybe it won't surprise you that materials came in top of the list, with 64% saying they need higher quality textbook, curricula, and other materials. Digital tools came in at 52%. More opportunities to collaborate, 45%. Time to observe other teachers at 44%. And also at 44%, more effective strategies for teaching students with special needs. One thing about the materials finding, I think there's some caution that's warranted in that, we know how important materials are, but also looking for the processes. One thing that we found is the peer observation, being so powerful, and so the idea of building the processes and helping support districts and school sites to look at things besides materials to help make a difference in implementation. We disaggregated these data a little bit, and at the elementary and secondary level, the materials response was about the same, but it was very interesting that non-rural teachers reported the need for better materials 12 percentage points higher than their rural counterparts, and that was a statistically significant finding. So it just points to that non-rural difference. The other disaggregation result that I want to pull out is that the need for peer observation was approximately 14 percentage points higher from elementary teachers than their secondary counterparts. So again, a pretty significant finding there as well. The question of how districts are approaching instructional materials. One thing that's not on the slide that I know my colleague Robert Sheffield has pointed out from his interview and focus group work is that there seems to be a little bit more of a pain point around math instructional materials than ELA. He's found that in his work. The district approaches that have emerged include formal structures for getting feedback and input from teachers on instruction and curriculum, organizing the curricula into units of study, complete with the ancillary materials, pacing guides, and benchmark assessments focused on the framework, aligning the sequence with the implementation of the smarter balanced blocks, and having release days for teachers to engage in that collaborative work. And there are places that Robert has found in his work where the districts are taking a different look at how they're using release days and trying to be more mindful and targeting those days to more collaborative work for teachers. So we also know, we've done some work about how teachers choose their materials. In addition to everything that gets provided, we know that that's not at all, and it's not everything. And so teachers do go and select things to supplement. The days of just kind of walking down the hall and getting from your colleague down the hall are long over. And in fact, teachers are going online for materials, lessons. Some of the findings here are from my colleagues Stacy Marple and Dan Bugler and others. And we find that when teachers go and look to supplement, key sources are Google and Pinterest, and Teachers Pay Teachers. A particular challenge is to find engaging materials for those students who aren't in the great middle. Maybe they'd be the struggling students on the one hand, or students who need to be stretched or challenged on the other hand. That's another real need that they have, is finding materials that target the groups more on the tails. The other kinds of considerations or criteria that teachers bring when they're looking for materials, they want to see that these materials efficiently and directly address the standards. It's obviously a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition, because they also need to address those standards at an appropriate depth of knowledge with the content itself and the activities, the lessons, assessment questions. This third one should be a given, but it's not, that the materials themselves be well written and free of errors. There are many things out there that have just basic errors in them. And a big one is just that they're easy to use. You go, you're looking, you have only so many hours in the day, you want to find something, okay, I can put this into practice right away. So ease of use in the classroom for themselves, for their students, and if they're pointing pointing to materials that might be used at home, that would be an easy on-ramp for parents as well. So it sort of begs the larger question, for districts, how can we help our teachers, give them the right guidance as to resources? Are there good curated resources? And also, how do we build that capacity for them to become better curators of resources so that they can quickly find the best things to supplement in their lessons? So this would be identifying rich texts, strong instructional tasks, tasks that are more on point for grade level expectations. I don't have the answers, but I do have some of the findings about what teachers are saying. So this next slide shows, kind of what collaborative activities teachers did in the 16-17 school year. A whopping 82% report that their school convenes grade level teams, PLCs, or other teams to support standards implementation. Teachers work together on instructional units. 73% of teachers report that. 65% report that school leaders provide opportunities for teachers to discuss the standards across grades and subjects. 60% say that teachers have the opportunities to collaborate with other teachers, and 58% say that school or district leaders provide adequate time to support implementation of the standards. Now, on this last one, I just want to point out that the prior year report was 51%. So again, that 51% to 58%, you know, as someone, yeah, as someone trained, you know, in statistics, you don't want to make too big a extrapolation from a trend of 2 points, but this is what you'd want to see, a step up from 51% to 58%, you know, on these. And again, this looks very different than when we had previous standards adoptions. I wish I had, you know, the data, you know, of similar surveys from 15 or 20 years ago, but I think we can, you know, we might expect to see that these numbers would be a lot lower about these practices. And as before, I think we still want higher on some of these numbers. You know, say, just to pick one at random, is 60% in terms of having sufficient opportunities to collaborate? Is that where we want to end up, or we got more work to do? So yeah, I would suggest that we have more work to do. So what do teachers need? Collaboration is good in itself, but it's better when it's focused on the more challenging work of analyzing curricular choices, creating assessments together. And so we have this quote from Elizabeth Stosich that teachers are more likely to revise their practices when the collaborative work is focused on designing, adapting, and improving specific instructional plans in students' work rather than more superficial discussions of practice. There's a somewhat different story in rural California where the data suggests that pulling out teachers and giving them a special assignment or adding in instructional coaches is a little less feasible. Arguably, when you pull out a great teacher in the rural setting, it might have a more disruptive effect than in a larger urban or suburban community. The pivotal role of a stable, experienced leadership and teaching staff was found by Timar and Carter in their piece from last year, where 77% of rural California teachers report that teachers in their school have some or a great deal of influence on determining the instructional materials used in the classrooms. And again, that's compared to the 63% from non-rural. Actually, I think that finding might be from our survey work. And then the technology finding in rural. So about 11% more rural California teachers than non-rural report using online PD offered by or through their district. And I kind of lump this in, well, necessity is the mother of invention. When you need to find stuff, you know, you're on the web, you are looking and finding. These rural teachers also report higher quality of the online PD. And the standards are shaping practice. We reached out to district leaders as well. This is part of the focus group work, and 2/3 report that there was a change in instructional strategies. A lot greater fidelity to standards, and the specific shifts that we're seeing are here in this next slide. On the ELA side, ELA teachers report putting more emphasis on having students do these things. As you can see, these four are pretty consistent across the four. Having students explain their reasoning or thinking in solving problems, construct viable arguments when supported with evidence, analyze how multiple texts address similar themes, or use evidence from a text to make an inference or support conclusions. They said they spent less emphasis on things like test-taking strategies, engaging in independent reading, participating in whole class discussions, and this sort of thing. So, a real shift towards some of these behaviors that are consistent with the standards, what we'd want to see. On the math side, a lot, I'm heartened by this first finding. About 2/3 spending more placing more emphasis on having students explain their reasoning and methods for solving a problem, compare and contrasting different methods for solving a problem, applying math in real-world contexts, and you can see the remainder. So, as with a lot of the stuff that I've been sharing in this presentation so far, the question is this good enough? These are over 50%, but given the big shifts we've seen throughout the state, wouldn't we want to see this even higher? So again, yeah. Let's see, I don't have the instrument, but it would have been something like, have you, my emphasis on, there would have been a long list of these, and my emphasis on this has, decreased slightly, increased a lot, would be on the one side, stayed the same, might be the middle category, and then decreased slightly or decreased significantly, something along those lines. Again, apologies, I don't have the instrument with me, but it would have had that kind of...
If you're asking teachers if they already felt that they were already doing it significantly, then it may not have increased, in which case 50% increasing may be a really good number depending on where they started at.
Yep.
So yeah, it's hard to say.
I agree. And likewise, just as with the ELA, there were some of the areas of less emphasis. So on the math side, less emphasis would have been on things such as listening to the teacher explain, observe the teacher demonstrate, or model a mathematics procedure, or solve a problem. 21% report increasing emphasis on that. Again, as with the ELA, practicing test-taking strategies. Again, 21% report increases in that. So with that, I'll pivot to kind of what's going on. So this is all, just to recap, this is all in this great brief that came out in October of 2017, and I'll make sure, working with staff, I'll make sure that you all have the link for this or the report itself. In some ways, I really just skimmed the surface of what's in here. It's a much richer document. Although the links that are in this presentation and the links in here are great for those of you who want to dig a little deeper. With that, let me transition to kind of what's going on now with our 2018 work. One emphasis this year is in systematic knowledge sharing. There's been, an explosion of networks to share insights into standards implementation and to help support that. West Ed is often in that role of how can we bridge and help the knowledge sharing be more systematic, kind of trying to help with that challenge of knowledge management. Let's get the bright spots and bright lights disseminated, and hopefully bringing a little bit of order to what can be this chaotic explosion of networks. We are also connecting schools, districts, and counties. I mentioned this CalSTAN, the Technical Assistance Network, the Measure to Improve network, where we're bringing together staff from 14 county offices of education for knowledge sharing, exposure to tools related to standards implementation that they can then bring back and have access to with their with their district staff. We continue to work with Math in Common and Leading with Learning, and a lot more, for those of you that are interested in digging deeper, a lot more is available on the web at the Center for the Future of Teaching and Learning's website, thecenter.wested.org. With that, I will take a break for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Does anybody have any questions? Well, you certainly gave us a lot to think about. I think in terms of kind of seeing standards implementation, making progress, but not quite maybe where we'd like to see full implementation look like, is important to kind of keep a tab on and keep your hand on the pulse of the implementation statewide of the standards that are developed. So I appreciate this informative report. Thank you.
You're welcome. Stay tuned. We'll have more information from 2018, and we can come back if you'll have us. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it is 12 o'clock, but we are almost done with our agenda here. I think all we have left is commissioner reports. So can we push through this and then maybe do commissioner reports, adjourn the meeting, and then have our lunch after that? Okay, sounds good. So does anybody have any commissioner reports? Yeah, Commissioner Naditz.
I just want to follow up on what Dr. Gregson said yesterday. I've been observing several days, and I know Yolanda was able to come one day as well and may want to jump in, of the work of the World Language Standards Advisory Committee. And as we've seen with the previous committees, both for frameworks and standards, the work that is coming out of this committee is absolutely incredible. So I really look forward to the remaining days that they have. They have to do this work incredibly quickly, and then I think you'll be really impressed with the content that's coming your way in November.
On that happy note, I've been attending the VAPA Standards Advisory Committee meetings, and I have to say that the CDE staff has been really impressive in how they're leading the 5 disciplines. We have 21 members, and it's split between the performing arts, digital, and visual. Letty's been wonderful. I wanted to give a shout out to her. And Dr. Gregson did this really great, pulls them back on what the difference is between the standards, the framework, and the instructional materials whenever they need that kind of guidance on where, in their work on the standards revision. So we've had 2 meetings. We have 2 more.
Thank you. Any other commissioners would like to report out? Okay. Do we go to public comment or?
Yes.
Okay. Would any members of the public like to speak? Okay, Will Parrish, IQC Emeritus, come on down.
I know the danger of speaking right before lunch, so I'm going to be really quick. All I'm going to say is thank Brian very much. Where's Brian? Oh, yeah. Yeah, hey, Brian. For the emphasis that he put in his presentation on the environmental principles and concepts as a Category 1, Criterion 15 part of that process. So the environment and environmental literacy has become front and center for teaching in the 21st century. And other states are going to follow what California does. The published materials will go into many other states beyond California. So let's do the maximum benefit we can for the students and hold the publishers to a high standard on incorporating the environmental principles and concepts to go big, right? So remember, Category 1, Criteria 15. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, Leslie Schwartz, and I'm feeling like a dinosaur because he's IQC, but I'm Curriculum Commission, 1998 to 2002. So as a former school board member, and I think I was probably one of the very few who actually took this volunteer job that you all have as a school board member, because who wants to do that? School boards don't. But I was keenly interested. So we were the first group that started with, at back then it was called IMAPs and CRPs. So this was when this all started. So after I got off the school board, the only thing you can do with that, if you're not from education, is go work for a publisher because they need to understand all this. So that's what I do for a day job, but I'm not here to talk about that. I wanted to say the one thing I've observed since 1998 when I had my first panel that is the hardest to do when you're facilitating is paying attention to the panel members who are not the talkative ones. It is the hardest job because it's so easy to get caught up with those forces of nature, because every room has one. If you didn't have one, one will become one. And the quiet people are hard to pay attention to because you're so busy taking that energy in. And I learned fast because my first group I had, it was the war of the math wars, okay? And I had people who had won the war with the standards and people who were upset who hadn't won, and the two groups were clashing. And I got called out into the hall by a panel member saying, I don't feel safe here. But thank goodness she did, right? Thank goodness she said that. But it was a wake-up call to me. And I have to say, it's hard work being a facilitator. It's also very rewarding to do that. And nobody here had to live through AB 2519. Am I right, staff? Yeah. 26 language arts programs, 14 math programs, just my panel, okay? So did we do a good job like you guys are doing? No. But did we learn how to then set up all the standards and criteria maps and what that looks like? You bet. So I just want to say good luck going forward, because now the new piece that wasn't there when I was there is the cone of silence, which is fine. It makes your work easier in terms of watching all of us who are there kind of hovering. But pay attention to the quiet ones, because it's hard for them when there's a force of nature in the room. So thank you.
Do we have any other members of the public would like to comment? Okay. Board Member Rucker, would you like to comment?
Well, on behalf of my board member colleagues, Eileen Strauss, who had to leave, I just want to say we were thrilled and heartened to see the training that you all went through today to initiate this new process, getting into the work that you're about to undertake on the science adoption. This is probably going to be the largest adoption this state has ever looked at, and the field is very excited about it. And I'm very excited to see you all make the commitment that you're making to do this work. And let me congratulate you now at the beginning of the process for the work that you are about to do. But on the serious side, not only is this science adoption going to be the first one we've done in a very long time, this adoption will be very different from any other adoption that we've done since I've been on the board. So the work that the staff has done in planning your training and introducing you to the criteria is very important. So I also want to take the opportunity. You saw Eileen and I being very animated talking here. We want to take the opportunity to also offer you some advice. The criteria really is your guide. The criteria really and truly works. Trust the process, because the process does work. Trust your training. Trust the staff, because the staff really is there to help you. More importantly, trust the commitment of the people who will come to your panel. You can assume that you're going to have conflict or some disagreements. I have found in my work I learn more from the people I disagree with, because it helps me to cement my thinking and my understanding of the issue or of the conversation or topic that we're having the disagreement on. So do not be afraid of disagreement. And probably more importantly, in looking at group dynamics, you are not there to be the counselor or the healer. You're there to be the peer and the leader. Leadership is not an easy task to take on. Leadership is different when we're talking about the work you are undertaking, because people will be guided by how you react as the leader of the group and by how you help the group's dynamic to continue moving forward and to stay on task. The most important thing to remember about groups is they naturally want to do something other than what they're assigned to do. and they will work very hard to help lead you off that track as well. And so you can lead the group by making people do, or you can lead the group by helping people make the right choices. And so Eileen and I sat and listened to the training and watched what you all were doing. You all are naturals at leadership and at doing this work. So we're not worried about what you are undertaking. We have great faith in this process, but we have truly great faith in you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we should let's adjourn the meeting of the Instructional Quality Commission, right? Okay. Thank you.